By this time next year, Colton Reid said, loud enough for the whole hotel lobby to hear, you'll be coming to me on your knees. He said it quietly, almost kindly. That was what made it frightening. And I won't answer the door. Grace Holloway, 24 years old, housekeeper at the Pine Ridge Motor Inn, stood in the first-floor corridor with her stainless steel cart, fresh towels, a trash liner, a bottle of cleaning spray. Behind her, two young men from his office leaned in the doorway of room 203, watching. At the front desk, Patty Coleman, the front desk manager, stood completely still. She'd heard every word. The 5th of August, Monday, 8:47 in the morning. Colton Reid said the words he believed would settle the matter forever. He was wrong. 11 months later, on the Sunday that Holloway House opened its doors, the line stretched from the front porch all the way to the bend in Cedar Road. People drove in from Asheville and over the mountain pass. The local paper ran it on the front page. And Colton Reid's office in Hendersonville was dark. Suppliers had canceled contracts one by one. Partners had stopped answering their phones. And the bank that had financed his projects for 3 years was demanding early repayment. But that August morning, Grace just looked at him, gave a small nod, and rolled her cart to the next room. She had 2:05 to finish. The outside of that window hadn't been washed in months. Cross Creek, North Carolina, a small town in the Blue Ridge foothills, an hour up Highway 25 from Asheville. In summer, tourists came through for kayak tours and apple festivals. In winter, the town went quiet. 3 things kept it alive: the Wilson sawmill, the food co-op, and the tourist trade that fed half the population from May through October. Grace had come to Cross Creek 5 years ago, when she was 19. She arrived with $800, a backpack, and her grandfather Lewis's notebook, fat, leather-covered, with a brass clasp. Grandpa Lewis had run a small inn in Asheville for 40 years, until illness took him away from it. He died when Grace was 12. Everything he owned was given away or thrown out. But she'd hidden that notebook under her mattress the same day and hadn't let go of it since. The notebook held everything: how to receive guests so they'd come back, how to prepare a room, not just clean, but so a person felt they'd arrived somewhere that expected them. The smell of the right linen, a touch of dried lavender, never chemical. The temperature of the water in the pitcher on the table, a small card with the guest's name on the pillow. Her grandfather called it invisible hospitality. Guests shouldn't see the work, he wrote. They should only see the result. Grace had read the notebook so many times, the pages had split along the creases. She knew it by heart. She still read it. She'd found Pine Ridge by accident, saw a handwritten sign in the window and walked in. The owner, Bud Turner, 70, hired her the same day. Not because she impressed him, because 3 other housekeepers had quit in the last month. He paid $10.20 an hour. In 5 years, he never raised it once. The motel was old, 12 rooms, a parking lot full of cracks, air conditioners that hummed like transformers. Tourists stayed there only when everything else in town was full. But Grace worked as though it were a 4-star property. She knew the hospital corner, fold the sheet just right so it never pulled loose. She knew that the mildew smell from the bathrooms wasn't fixed with chemicals, but with ventilation and a half cup of baking soda left overnight. She knew that a guest traveling with an infant needed the room farthest from the air unit, quieter by the wall. Small things, but because of them, Pine Ridge sometimes got reviews that said, tiny, but surprisingly comfortable. Grace read those reviews. Bud didn't. Over time, she'd taken on things nobody paid her for. Replacing burned-out bulbs, touching up chipped trim with leftover paint, replanting the entrance flowers that died every summer in the heat. Bud would notice, shrug, and say he really ought to make that official. He never did. In her 5th year, Grace understood that waiting wasn't going to get her anywhere. Her grandfather died the way people die who have always been larger than just their presence. Slowly, across one summer and the next, while Grace was young enough not to fully understand and old enough to remember forever. He was in a hospital in Asheville, and she visited every Saturday, riding the bus with her mother because they didn't have a car back then. On the last Saturday, he took her hand and said one thing. "A place of lodging isn't built where you put the walls. It's built where you put your heart." Grace didn't understand then. She was 12, and she figured he was just confused from the medication. She took the notebook because it was sitting on the nightstand, and when her mother said, "Take what you want," it was the only thing she wanted. Everything else got divided up and cleared out in 3 days. That's how it goes when there's no one to watch over things. The first years in Cross Creek, the notebook lived in her backpack. She opened it rarely. She was afraid to wear it out. Then she realized that was ridiculous. A notebook's for reading. She started reading. At first, she just read. Then she began to notice she was doing at the motel exactly what was written there. Not because she was following instructions, just because it felt right, and her grandfather had known it was right 40 years earlier, and now she knew it too. Cross Creek received her the way small towns receive newcomers. Not unfriendly, but with distance. The first year, she barely spoke to anyone outside of work. Then she started greeting people by name. She memorized names, which was also from the notebook. Then Myrtle invited her for coffee. Then Patty told her which regulars liked orange juice and which liked apple. A small town opens slowly, like a book with a stiff spine. You just can't rush it. By her 4th year at Bud's, she knew everyone, more or less. She knew that Kyle from the garage across the street had gotten divorced 2 years ago and had been working 7 days a week since, not because of the business, but because there was nothing to go home to. She knew that Dave, the roofer, only took honest jobs and had once turned down a $12,000 contract because the client wanted to use substandard materials. She knew that Patty Coleman had dreamed of teaching school, had enrolled, studied 2 years, and quit. Not because she couldn't do it, but because her mother got sick and she needed to work. And it stayed working ever since. Grace wrote these things in the notebook, not because she planned to tell anyone, just because the people around her were interesting, and their stories deserved to be remembered. She'd also started saving. Not from her salary. There wasn't much to save there. She picked up extra work, cleaning houses on weekends for $40 a time, washing the windows at the co-op once a week. She rented a room off the kitchen at Myrtle Hargrove's place for $250 a month. Myrtle was alone, afraid of the dark, and glad to have someone in the house. They became friends the way people do when they share a space. First, just good morning and good night. Then coffee. Then long conversations on the porch. Myrtle had worked at a mountain tourist camp when she was young. She remembered how outdoor recreation was organized. Trailheads, routes, overnight stays for hikers. She'd talk, and Grace would listen, the way only she knew how. Not to make conversation, but to remember. Myrtle never asked why Grace wrote it all down in the back pages of the old notebook. She just kept talking. Colton Reid arrived in Cross Creek 2 years ago. He was 43. He'd come from Charlotte with money, a mid-level developer's reputation, and a very specific plan. Buy 5 older properties at the edge of town and build a 30-room boutique hotel for the Asheville tourist trade. The town council had approved his permits in 3 months. Some people said it was because the committee chairman played golf with him. Some people said he'd just paid the right people at the right time. In a small town, the difference is usually small. Reid walked around town with his architect pointing at buildings. That one goes. That one gets a makeover. That one's in the way. That was exactly what he'd said about the old house on the corner of Cedar and First, the one that had belonged to Ella Bradshaw, 78, widow, for the last 37 years. He'd offered her $90,000. Grace later found out the market value was $160,000. Ella Bradshaw went to his office. He'd rented space in the bank building on Main Street and laid his letter on his desk. $90,000 for the house where I buried my husband, she said. Mr. Reid, I'm not a wealthy woman, but I'm not so poor that I can't recognize when I'm being cheated. Reid smiled. That particular smile that means you don't understand how this works. You don't have to sell, Mrs. Bradshaw, but in a year, construction starts on all 4 sides of your property. Trucks, workers, dust. You won't be able to open a window. Your house will be worth $50,000. Ella stood, took the letter, and left. Grace had first seen Reid at a town council meeting the previous September, where he was presenting his project. She'd gone by chance. She wanted to ask about the road repair near the motel that kept getting postponed. He stood at the projector in his dark blue blazer, talking about tourist cluster concepts. The slides showed a rendering of his new hotel, gleaming, glass-fronted, fitting nowhere in the mountain landscape or the scale of the town. 30 rooms, restaurant, conference suite, he was saying. Premium demographic, average spend 1.5 times the current local market. We're not competing with existing local properties. We're capturing a different segment. Grace thought at the time, a different segment. That was code. Code for the people who stay at Pine Ridge and the local guest houses. We don't want them. We want the ones who pay more. And never mind what happens to the others when they get squeezed out. They simply disappear from the picture. She asked her question about the road. Vandala Cross, the council chair, said the road was in next year's plan. It had been in next year's plan for 3 years running. On the way out, Reid stopped next to her. They ended up in the same aisle, and said, without quite looking at her, "You're from Pine Ridge?" "Yes." "Bud mentioned you." A pause. "You do good work there." Then he walked on. She thought about it later. That wasn't a compliment. That was an appraisal. When she went to Bud 6 months later with her offer, she remembered that appraisal. And she moved fast, because she understood that Reid would move the same way. Grace saw Ella at the co-op the day after the rejected offer, standing with heavy bags, waiting for someone to help carry them. Grace helped. Then again. Then she started stopping by, first with an errand as an excuse, then without one. Ella lived 2 blocks from Myrtle, and Grace passed that way almost every day. She didn't know then that in the basement of Ella Bradshaw's house, there were folders of documents that Ella's husband, Harold, had signed in the county courthouse 37 years ago. Or that one of those folders would eventually change everything. In March of the following year, Bud Turner told Grace he was selling the motel. She thought he was joking. Bud wasn't the joking type. "Reid made me a fair offer," he said. "I'm tired, Grace. I'm 71. My knees don't bend right." "How much?" she asked. "That's not your business." "How much, Bud?" He sighed. $120,000. The appraised value of the property, building, and land together was $180,000. Grace knew this because 3 years ago, she'd helped Bud file his tax returns when he'd gotten confused with the paperwork. Bud, that's $60,000 less than fair value. Cash and no hassle. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked at his hands. "Have you already agreed?" "We sign Friday." This was Tuesday. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay in her room off Myrtle's kitchen, listening to the hallway clock tick, and counted. She had $4,280, a year of extra work. The motel cost $120,000. The gap was absurd. But she'd spent the past year doing something else, too. She'd attended an information session run by the county's Small Business Support Office. They'd called her back after 3 weeks. She'd qualified for an interview. They'd explained that SBA loans existed for small businesses in hospitality. 4.5%, 20-year terms. Requirements: 20% down from personal funds, a business plan, at least 2 years of verifiable experience in the field. She had $4,280. She needed $24,000. The gap, $19,720 by Wednesday morning. She called the bank at 8 a.m., explained the situation. The loan officer, a young woman named Cynthia Poole, said, "Miss Holloway, I sympathize, but a bridge loan of this size in 72 hours isn't something we can process." Then she added quietly, "Have you applied for an SBA loan?" "Yes." "And the status?" "Pre-approved." A pause. "Then let me see what I can do with interim financing. Call me back at 4. At 4, Cynthia said the bank would approve a bridge loan of $20,000 secured against the SBA pre-approval and 5 years of employment history. Repayment at SBA closing no later than 90 days. Myrtle was still up when Grace got home that night, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug and a book. "You know Bud's selling," Grace said. "I know. Whole town knows by now. Small town." "I'm thinking about buying it." A pause. Myrtle set her book down. "Do you have the money?" "I have a pre-approved loan and about $4,000 of my own." "Down payment is 20%? $24,000. So you're short nearly 20. "Yes." Myrtle held her mug in both hands and looked into her tea for a long time. "Grace," she said at last, "I have some money. Not a lot. But I can lend you $15,000. No interest. Pay me back when you can." Grace stared at her. "Myrtle, don't say anything. Just answer me one thing. Are you sure?" A long pause. Grace thought about the notebook, about the note card at the trailhead parking lot by the lake, about what Vesper Crow, the health inspector, had said. Shame it would be to close it. About Glenn the cyclist writing, "Why doesn't this place have a booking page?" "Sure," Grace said. "Then go to sleep," said Myrtle. "Bank opens early." On Thursday morning, Grace went to Bud. "I'll buy the motel," she said. $120,000. Cash at closing by Friday. Here's the pre-approval. Bud looked at the paper like he'd never seen one before. "Grace," he started. "Bud, you paid me $10.20 for 5 years. No raise. I painted your trim and replanted your flowers because I cared about the place. Give me this building. It deserves someone who cares." The silence lasted a long time. "Reid's already waiting," said Bud. "I know. Let him wait one more day." On Friday at 3 in the afternoon, Bud Turner signed with Grace Holloway. $120,000, closing in 30 days upon SBA financing. Colton Reid found out that same evening. What he said when his office manager called him at 6 is not recorded. But on Monday, when Grace came in for her final shift to finish the week and collect her things, Reid was standing in the lobby. That was when he said those words. "By this time next year, you'll be coming to me on your knees, and I won't answer the door." Grace looked at him, gave a small nod, and rolled her cart to the next room. She had 2:05 to finish. The window hadn't been washed outside in months. The deal closed in the first week of May, when the mountains were just beginning to green. Pine Ridge Motor Inn, by that point, looked exactly like a building that had been neglected for 5 years. The parking lot cracks had become potholes. 2 air units had died over the winter. The roof above rooms 4 and 5 leaked at every rain, and the facade had peeled back to a layer of paint from the 70s. Pale yellow, completely wrong. Grace had 0 additional funds, just a deed, a loan, and her grandfather's notebook. The first morning she woke up in room 12, the farthest, the quietest, with a view of an empty parking lot and 3 pine trees. Bud had left a folding chair and a coffee maker nobody had thrown away. The coffee maker worked every other try. The chair creaked. Grace woke at 5:30 and sat with coffee at the window until it got light. She wasn't sentimental about it. She just liked that hour. The first day she walked every room with a notepad, writing not what she saw, but what she felt. Smell in 3. Stale carpet. Needs replacing. Humidity in 8. Ventilation blocked. Check the grill. Creak in the floor of 5, right at the door. Guests wake up in the night and step on it. Wake the neighbor. Not a building code issue, just uncomfortable. Granddad would have noticed. Room 6 was the best. South-facing, sun from 8 a.m. on, bed position so the light didn't hit your eyes. Grace decided 6 would be her first offer to guests with small children or older travelers. An invisible detail nobody notices, except the person who slept well. The linens needed replacing entirely. The old ones were clean but stiff, with a chlorine smell. She found a wholesale supplier in Hendersonville that sold hotel-grade textiles with minor defects, a mark on a pillowcase, a mismatched button on a duvet cover. She took 24 sets for $840, half the retail price. She laundered out the stains at home and replaced the buttons. That took 1 evening and 1 free Saturday. Glenn the cyclist, the one who wrote the first review, later asked her in a message, "Where's the bedding from? It smells right, not chemical." She replied, "Lavender, small sachet in the wardrobe." "Where do you get it?" "I dry it myself. Myrtle grows it in her garden." Myrtle had learned about the lavender by accident. Grace had asked permission to cut a few stems and explained why. Myrtle said, of course, and by the end of summer, she'd gone out and planted 2 more bushes. Since it's become a thing. The mockery started quickly. 3 days after the news spread through town, Grace stopped into the coffee shop on Main Street. Two men were sitting there. One worked for a local contractor. The other was a regular whose name she didn't know. They didn't lower their voices when she came in, not because they were unkind. They just didn't think she was listening. "Bud finally lost it," the first one was saying. "Selling to the housekeeper." "Well, she knows those rooms inside and out," the second said. "Then again, knowing them and running a business, those are two different things." 6 months and she'll sell. Same price. Or fold before that. They laughed. Quietly. The way friends laugh over something they think is obvious. Grace took her coffee, thanked the cashier, and left. On the bulletin board at the post office, someone had pinned an old flyer. Pine Ridge Motor Inn for sale, clearly from the year before. Someone had found it and tacked it back up. A joke. Maybe. Worse was the business association meeting in late May, which Grace attended for the first time. Local owners, the coffee shop, the gift store, the kayak rental, 3 guest house operators. She introduced herself and explained who she was. The silence was short, but noticeable. Then Don Page, who ran a guest house on Riverside Road, asked, "Grace, you said you were a housekeeper there for how long?" 5 years. "So you've never run a business?" "No." "Well," said Don, he wasn't an unkind man, just an honest one. "Good luck to you. It's different." She nodded and sat down. She wrote in her notepad, "First meeting, Don Page. Honest. The rest? Polite. Nobody believes it. That's okay." 6 months later, Don Page came up to her at the same meeting and said, "Grace, would you be interested in a joint package for the cycling route? You're at one end of town. I'm at the other." She said, "Come in Friday. I'll have time." They talked it over. It worked. The first week, she spent her time making a list. Not a renovation plan, just a list. What was broken? What worked badly? What only looked bad but was actually fine? This, too, was from the notebook. Don't spend on appearance. Spend on what the guest will feel. The roof came first. Grace called 3 roofing companies from surrounding towns. 2 quoted around $8,000. The third, Dave Nash, who worked alone with 1 helper, said $4,200 and added, "But I need a week. I'm in Brevard right now." "I'll wait," Grace said. "Most people don't." "I'm not most people." Dave came 8 days later, looked at the roof, made sounds, gave her a final number, 4,200, as promised. He listed the materials she'd need, explained that a third of the cost was delivery, and offered, if she picked up the materials herself at the wholesale depot in Hendersonville, he'd knock off $500. She drove there the next morning at 5:30 in the old Ford van that Bud had left in the lot and forgotten to mention in the sale. While Dave worked on the roof, she painted the facade. Not new paint. At a building supply in Asheville, she'd found a batch of quality exterior paint with a rejected color. Instead of mint white, it had come out cool slate gray green. The owner wanted to throw it out. Grace looked at the color and said, "That's mountain slate. Perfect for the foothills." She took 12 cans for $120. She painted it herself, 3 or 4 hours an evening after the main work was done. Because the motel had to keep running alongside the renovation, and the first 3 guests arrived 2 weeks after closing, while the paint was still curing and Dave was still hammering up on the roof. The first guest, a solo cyclist from Pittsburgh named Glenn, wrote in the guest book, Why doesn't this place have a booking page? Best night's sleep for 100 miles. He had 4,000 followers in a cycling community online. He posted a photo of his room, hospital-cornered, a note card with his name on the pillow, a small bunch of wildflowers and a water glass on the nightstand. Grace hadn't asked him to post anything. She'd just made the room the way her grandfather taught her. The second guest arrived 3 days later, another cyclist, a friend of Glenn's. Then 2 more. Then a pair of hiking tourists. Then a family driving to the Apple Festival who couldn't find space anywhere else. By mid-June, all 12 rooms were full on weekends. By end of June, nearly every day. The word of mouth ran not through social media, but through the camper parking at the lake 8 miles out, where hikers and kayak tourists stopped overnight. There was a corkboard there where people pinned handwritten notes. Someone had put up a card. Pine Ridge on Cedar Road. Housekeeper bought it. Actually good now. The card stayed up for 3 weeks. That was enough. The air conditioners Grace fixed herself, or rather she replaced the filters, cleared the drain lines, and swapped out thermostats that were older than she was. That cost $180 in parts and 2 video tutorials watched on her phone. Kyle from the garage across the street came over one evening. Not for any reason, just the way people stop by in small towns when they want to talk and don't know how to say so. He brought 2 iced teas from the coffee shop. "Heard you had trouble with the unit in 9, he said. "How'd you know?" "Patty mentioned it. We talk sometimes in the parking lot." Grace looked at him. "9's fine, just a little loud." "I can take a look, no charge." "Kyle, you run your own shop. I don't want to. I handled the wiring at Bud's for 2 years, for free." He shrugged. "I like what you're doing with this place." Room 9 turned out to be fine. Kyle confirmed it and even explained the noise. A bearing in the fan. Not critical. Replace when convenient. They ended up sitting on the parking lot curb for an hour talking. About the town, about how the tourist flow was shifting, about how Cross Creek could be more interesting if someone took the cycling infrastructure seriously. Grace wrote it in the notebook, in the section for future ideas. The first real setback came in July. The county health inspector arrived without notice, Thursday morning at 9, while Grace was changing sheets in room 2. The inspector, an older man named Vesper Crow, showed his badge and said he'd received a complaint about conditions at Pine Ridge Motor Inn. Grace set the folded towels on the bed and walked him through all 12 rooms. He inspected for an hour and a half, wrote things down, looked under the sinks, opened the vent covers, got behind the refrigerators. At the end, he sat in the lobby chair and studied his notepad for a long time. "Miss Holloway," he said, "it's an old building. By the 1993 code, you're compliant. By the updated 2018 code, you're not. No fire escape for the wing corridor, no step-free access to 2 rooms, no secondary emergency lighting in the hallways." Grace wrote down all 3 points. "Deadline?" she asked. 60 days to correct. Otherwise, a cease operations notice." "Who filed the complaint?" Crow paused. "I'm not required to disclose." But the way he said it, quickly, without meeting her eyes, told Grace that he wasn't going to say the name because the name was worth more than he was. The fire escape she found at a construction auction 2 weeks later. A metal fire stair pulled off a demolished warehouse, $600. Installation with anchor bolts into the brick wall, another $400. The step-free access to the 2 end rooms came from wooden ramps that Deal, Dave the roofer's brother, put together over a weekend for $250. The emergency lighting, LED battery units, $80 each, 4 of them. Total, under $2,000. Vesper Crow came back 41 days later. He checked for an hour. At the end, he said, "Everything's in order. Notice is closed," and added at the door, quietly, "You've got a good place here, Miss Holloway. Shame it would be to close it." Grace thanked him and went back to work. Only that evening, at Myrtle's, did she let herself breathe. Just sat with both hands wrapped around her tea. August brought something unexpected. A journalist. Not local, from Asheville, a freelance contributor to the Mountain Times travel section. A young man named Theo King, baseball cap, voice recorder. He'd seen the post in the cycling community and driven up to see for himself. He spent 2 hours with her, watched her make up rooms. She didn't stop working while they talked. Took notes. At the end asked, "How do you know all this?" She brought out her grandfather's notebook and set it on the counter in front of him. He picked it up carefully, the way you handle something very old. "Can I photograph it?" The cover, yes. Inside, no. The article ran the first Saturday of September. The headline, "Invisible Hospitality: How a Cross Creek Housekeeper Reimagined the Small Motel." The photo showed the mountain slate facade against trees just starting to turn, and the cover of the notebook. By Saturday evening, Grace had 27 booking requests. By Monday, 51. She set up online booking that same night. Through the end of October, all 12 rooms full every weekend, half of them on weekdays. That was when Colton Reid struck. The real blow. First Monday of October, a young lawyer in a blue suit came into Pine Ridge. He laid an envelope on the counter and said he represented Reid Development, LLC. Inside was a lawsuit. The argument? The land under the motel parking lot, 70 by 40 feet, according to a new survey commissioned by Reid Development, actually belonged to an adjacent parcel that Reid had purchased in August. Since the parking lot was a required facility without which the motel couldn't legally operate as lodging, the defendant was invited to either purchase the disputed parcel at the price set by Reid's appraiser, $47,000, or acknowledge that the property couldn't function as a motel and cease operations. Hearing in Henderson County Court in 31 days. Grace read the suit twice, set it on the counter, looked at the lawyer. "Are you hungry?" she said. He blinked. "I'm sorry?" "You drove an hour from Hendersonville. Would you like some coffee?" I'm not accepting the offer, and I'm not signing anything. But I can pour you a coffee while you drive back." The lawyer took the coffee. She could tell because 3 minutes later, the car out front left with a paper cup on the dashboard. Grace didn't have a lawyer. She couldn't afford one. She called the legal clinic at the community college in Brevard, where law students handled small business cases under faculty supervision for free. They called back the next day. "Come Thursday, bring everything from your closing." Thursday, she brought everything. The deed from Bud, the county land registry certificate, the survey map she'd received at closing. The supervising instructor, Edward Payne, slight, thick glasses, spread the papers on the table and studied the maps for a long time. "Miss Holloway," he said finally, "the boundary line on Reid's survey doesn't match the boundary on your registry certificate. You see here?" He pointed. "It's shifted." 16 feet, Grace said, which means the survey Reid commissioned is either incorrect or... Yes, we need to request the original plat from the county archive and the survey history for this parcel over the last 40 years. That will take about 2 weeks.
The hearing is in 31 days.
Then we don't have 2 weeks. We have 1. 1 week later, Edward Payne called her at 7 in the morning. "Found it," he said. In 1986, the then owner of the adjacent parcel entered into a right-of-way and parking easement with the then owner of the motel. The agreement is recorded in the County Register of Encumbrances. If it was never terminated in any subsequent transaction, and I've checked, it was not, then the parking area is a recorded easement. Reid's survey doesn't change that. The lawsuit has no legal basis. Grace was quiet for a moment.
Who registered the easement in '86?
Payne checked. Harold Bradshaw, notarized by Ella Bradshaw. Grace closed her eyes. Harold Bradshaw, Ella's husband. The same house Reid had tried to buy for $90,000. The same Ella whose bags Grace had carried for the last year and a half. She called Ella at 8 a.m. "Ella, did your husband keep paperwork in the basement?"
"Oh, yes. 40 years I haven't touched it."
"I need a folder from 1986. It's an easement agreement on the motel parking." A long pause.
"Harold always said those papers would matter someday,"
Ella said.
"I thought he was exaggerating. Old men do that."
"Would you mind if I came by?"
"I've put the kettle on."
The folder turned up quickly. Ella kept everything in chronological order, the way Harold had. The original easement agreement, notarized with the county seal, was in perfect condition. Harold Bradshaw, evidently, could keep documents as well as he could file them. They sat at Ella's kitchen table and drank tea while Grace photographed every page. "You're not asking why I need this," Grace said.
"I don't need to ask,"
Ella answered.
"I've watched that man look at other people's things, like they're already his. He just hasn't been given them yet."
The hearing at Henderson County Courthouse was held the 3rd Wednesday of October. The room was small, but more people showed up than expected. From Cross Creek, Myrtle Hargrove, Patty Coleman, Dave the roofer, Kyle from the garage, and several others Grace hadn't expected to see. Just neighbors, just townspeople. Ella Bradshaw sat in the front row in her best blue coat. Reid's lawyer spoke confidently. Survey, ownership, right of access, technical details designed to obscure. He was smooth and expensive and very sure of himself. Edward Payne stood up. He was 15 years younger than Reid's lawyer and probably 1/10 the billing rate. He laid 4 documents on the table: Grace's registry certificate, the archival plat from the county records, the copy of the easement from Ella's basement, and, separately, a certificate confirming that the easement agreement appeared in the active County Register of Encumbrances, Henderson County, volume such and such, page such and such. "Your Honor," Payne said, "the plaintiff is contesting use of a parcel that has been a recorded easement since 1986. This easement has never been terminated in any subsequent transaction involving either property. The lawsuit has no legal basis." Reid's lawyer asked for a recess, then another, then announced that the survey may contain technical inaccuracies, and his client was prepared to settle. Judge Harris, 60, with the manner of someone who has seen this exactly 150 times and stopped being surprised long ago, removed his glasses and looked at the lawyer. "Mr. Aitken, you're saying the survey your client commissioned and filed as the basis for this lawsuit contains inaccuracies, which you're now prepared to acknowledge in open court?" A pause. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then the suit is dismissed. Judge Harris put his glasses back on. And I'd recommend that the county prosecutor's office review the circumstances of this survey, because filing a lawsuit based on demonstrably incorrect data is no longer a matter of technical inaccuracies. The room didn't gasp. This wasn't a movie. It just got very quiet. Then Ella Bradshaw, from the front row in her blue coat, said quietly to her neighbor, "Harold knew." And her neighbor nodded. Reid wasn't in the courtroom himself. It turned out that on the same afternoon, he had somewhere else to be. Applechair Financial, the bank that had financed his Cross Creek project, had called him in for a meeting. Because the confusion around his survey had made it into the local press, Theo King had written a short piece the day after the hearing, and the bank felt it prudent to revisit the terms of his financing. 2 weeks later, the construction company he'd contracted, Forsyth & Sons, sent a letter terminating the agreement. Official reason? Revised risk assessment of the project. Unofficial. Forsyth Sr. called Patty Coleman and said, "I heard about the parking lot. We don't work with that kind of thing." Reid's Cross Creek project was frozen. The parcels he'd bought all year hung on him as unpaid debt without forward motion. By spring, he was selling them at whatever price he could get. Ella Bradshaw's house on Cedar and First still stood. Nobody offered her $90,000 again. Nobody offered her anything. In November, Grace changed the sign. Pine Ridge Motor Inn became Holloway House. She hadn't wanted to use her own name. It felt presumptuous. But Myrtle said,
"Grace, that's not presumption. That's honesty. Call things what they are."
And Ella added, "Harold always said, if you put your heart into something, put your name on it too." The new sign was wooden, walnut, cut by Dale from a board he'd been saving. Grace painted it in mountain slate. She thought sometimes about what the year looked like from the outside. April, the keys. May, first guests and the smell of paint. June, a peeling patch on the north wall and the list that never ended. July, the inspector in 60 days. August, cyclists and the newspaper article. September, full weekends. October, the lawsuit, the hearing, the clinic lawyer, and the folder from Ella's basement. November, a new name. 11 months, not one of them where she could simply breathe. But breathing wasn't really the point. Myrtle's money, $15,000. Grace paid back in the first Friday of February when the January books closed, and it was clear the numbers worked. Myrtle got the transfer, called, and said, "You didn't have to rush." Grace said, "Granddad wrote that debts to people matter more than debts to banks." Myrtle was quiet, and then said, "Your grandfather was a wise man." Kyle appeared in the life of Holloway House gradually, the way everything important arrives in a small town, not announced, just present. First, he just checked the air units, once a month, neighborly. Then, one evening, he brought 2 cans of paint. "Found this at the supplier. Mountain slate, almost exact match to yours. Thought you might need it for touch-ups." Then he helped hang the new walnut sign. Dave had brought it on his truck, and the 3 of them put it up on a Saturday morning. Dave holding, Kyle drilling, Grace standing on the step with a level calling out adjustments. When they stepped back to look, Kyle said, "That sits right." "Yes," she agreed. "Your grandfather would have thought so." She didn't answer, just looked at the sign. The walnut letter H leaned slightly right. They fixed it. The first Friday of December, they were drinking coffee in the Holloway House lobby, closed for the night, no guests coming in, just Patty finishing next week's bookings at the counter, and the two of them sitting by the window. Outside, the season's first real snow was falling. Cross Creek in snow looked like a town on a greeting card. "Are you happy with the garage?" Grace asked. "In general, yeah." Kyle turned his mug. "Sometimes I want something different. Don't know what." "Our cycling season starts in April. If you offered basic tune-ups for hikers, it's steady income and good repeat traffic." He looked at her. "Is that a business proposition?" "No," she smiled. "I'm just thinking out loud." Patty, at the counter, found something very interesting in her computer and studied it with great concentration. By fall of the following year, Holloway House had 4 people on payroll. Patty Coleman had come over from Pine Ridge when the new owner took over, and things went downhill. Dale was on retainer for everything wood and small repairs. A young woman from the next town over, Lucy, kept the rooms in a way that only people who were shown, not told, ever manage. Grace had shown her. The Blue Ridge Cycling Route Tourism Board invited Holloway House to join their recommended lodging registry. First full-year revenue? $174,000. Grace paid her SBA loan on schedule, every month, no delays. Her grandfather's notebook stood behind the reception counter, in a glass case on a shelf, open to the first page. The page where he'd written, "Guests shouldn't see the work. They should only see the result." A guest once asked what it was. "A manual," Grace said. "Yours?" "My grandfather's." "Was he in the hotel business?" "Yes." "Where's his hotel?" "Here," she said. Sometimes the price someone offers you isn't the real price of the thing. It's the price at which they'd like to take it. The real price is only known by the person who understands what they're holding. Did anyone ever tell you that you wouldn't make it with something you'd already nearly built? Tell us in the comments. And if you know someone who was underestimated by everyone around them, remember them today.